give the band, the worship team, the creative, the production team a round of applause this morning for all their hard work. And while we're doing that, I just want to say a huge thanks to all the dream team, all the people that served and gave so many hours over the last several weeks to make this day possible. A huge thank you to all of them as well. So again, welcome to Genesis today for our Christmas experience. My family was able to get away for just a little bit Friday night, go catch a movie. It was interesting. We went and watched Moana, and I'm a people watcher, you know, so I'm looking around the theater, and it was interesting how many teenagers were in the room for a kid's movie, and it was interesting how many adults were in the room watching the movie that did not have children with them. So even though it was primarily a kid's movie, they didn't come because their kids were saying, hey, we need to go watch this movie. But it just underscores a point that we're already familiar with, that everybody loves a good story. We love when there's some kind of narrative tension, there's some kind of drama, and at the end of the story, the hero or the heroine comes in and makes everything right and comes to save the day. But if we're not careful today, we will reduce the Christmas story to simply a feel-good story. And we'll do so because it is so familiar to us that many of us, we've been raised in church, and even if we haven't, because we live in the South or kind of the South, we're still familiar with all of the religious trappings of the Christmas season. And we all know the story of the miraculous conception, the unexpected trip to Bethlehem because Caesar Augustus decreed a census must be taken and everybody had to report to their homeland. We're familiar with, you know, no room in the inn, and they wind up in a cattle stall, and after Jesus is born, they put him in a manger of all places, a baby not placed in a crib, but a manger. We're familiar with the night sky outside of Bethlehem erupting with praise as angels interrupt the silence as the shepherd watched their lowly flocks by night and declare that a newborn king of the Jews has been born in Bethlehem. We're familiar with the shepherd's visit and the Magi journey from the east, which in case we're not familiar, the Magi didn't make it until a couple of years later. So that's okay. We can still put them in the nativity scene if everybody kind of has that whole thing set up. You don't have to go home and yank the Magi out of it. But they made a long journey, and they didn't get there for a couple of years. But that's okay. It still makes for a great story, but the familiarity of it all, if we're not careful, reduces it to a simple feel-good story. And what's interesting is that one of the most beautiful parts of the Christmas story is found in a part that we often skip over. Any book lovers in the room? Anybody just love to read? Like two of you? Let's just have a moment of confession, because I believe we ought to be transparent in the house of God. How many of you have not read a book since high school? How many of you will be honest enough to say, I didn't even read a book when I was in high school? Yeah, that's like the Moore school system right there. So, but that's okay. We still love you. I was one of those rare people. I love to read. I could never get enough books. I read all the times when I was a kid, especially a teenager. Even read a lot of fiction when I was in college. But I'm also one of those people, and if you're a book person, you're probably like this as well, that if I don't get captivated in the first couple of chapters, if there's not some kind of compelling narrative or tension that's created, I have a hard time journeying on in the book. Matter of fact, my library, I've got several books, both fiction and nonfiction, that I've not finished because the first several chapters just didn't captivate me enough to keep me journeying into the book. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite books that I've ever read, a fiction book I read when I was a teenager, was actually a book that the first time I picked it up, I just couldn't get into. Got through the first couple chapters and just like, yeah, you know, and I set it down. And I think it was summer vacation that year. It was like insanely hot outside. I didn't want to go outside, so I was looking for something to read. And that book was all that was there, so I picked it back up. And once I got through the first couple of chapters, the story began to pick up. And at that point, I could not put the book down, and it went on to become one of my favorite books. Well, what's interesting concerning the Christmas story is that the Gospels, the first four books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Two of the writers skip over the Christmas narrative altogether. Mark gives us no details whatsoever of the Christmas story. He begins with the story of John the Baptist, who was the forerunner to Jesus, and then launches straight into the life and the ministry of Jesus. John takes the Christmas story and paints it in the form of a metaphor, describing Jesus as the very essence of light and life as the Word made flesh, and then launches into the life and the ministry of Jesus. Luke is the one that gives us the most dynamic detail of the Christmas story. And usually in services like this and in the Christmas season, it's Luke's story that is read because it includes the most detail of the Christmas narrative. But Matthew's approach to the Christmas story is like one of those books that's just hard to get into. This is how Matthew begins his version of the Christmas story. Matthew 1:1. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. That's like, oh, wake me when it's over. Like, really? Like, Matthew, you're telling one of the most dynamic, historic, shaping stories in the history of humanity, and you begin it by telling the genealogies. I mean, some of you that were raised in church, there's probably been a time that you're like, man, I'm going to read through the Bible this year, and you get into Genesis, and it's all new, and it's exciting. It's the birth of the world, birth of humanity. You get into Exodus, and you get into the Egypt story, and the Red Sea, and all the signs and wonders, and it's new and exciting. Then you get into Leviticus, and Numbers, and it's like he begat him, and he begat him, and you're like, no, I'm done. Like, wait me when it's over sometime down the road. And Matthew chooses to begin the most incredible story in all the world by giving us a genealogy. But here's the deal. A genealogy in those days is kind of like what a resume would be for us. We live in a very individualistic society, so we go to great lengths to make ourselves look good, to portray ourselves in the best light. So we put together a resume that highlights our skills and our experiences, and we have a tendency to kind of hide, some of the not so glamorous parts, or to embellish, what we did at a previous job or something, because we want to be looked at in the best possible light. Well, a genealogy is how people did that in a culture that was very family-centered in those days, because a person's family, their clan, their heritage really it gave an idea to their identity that these are my people, therefore this is who I am. And the purpose of Matthew's gospel was written to a primarily Jewish audience. And Matthew was trying to state Jesus' credentials as Israel's long-awaited Messiah. And in the Old Testament, there's over 70 major prophecies about the coming Messiah. And one of them is that he will come from the lineage of King David, who was the most prominent king in Israel's history. Matter of fact, God had promised David that one of your ancestors will always sit upon the throne of Israel, and one day the Messiah will come from your lineage, and he will establish forever the kingdom of God. So Matthew is trying to help readers make the connection from Jesus all the way back to David. So he begins that way. Now, in Matthew's day, just like people do today, people had a tendency to kind of hide the not so glamorous parts of a resume. We know this from history, that King Herod, who was governor over the province that Jesus was born in, he had his genealogy altered several times, that he got sideways with some family, and he was like, you are dead to me? So he had his genealogy rewritten, so it had no record of those people ever being a part of his family. In the same way, there might have been a stop along the employment path where we kind of got sideways with a boss or an employer, and we don't really want to talk about that part. And when we're sending a resume to a prospective employer, we don't want them calling that boss or that employer, because we don't want to get into the details of how all that went wrong. So we might just leave that part out of a resume. Well, people would do that in genealogies. You know, if there's like a painful part of their past, or if there's like some family they don't want to talk about. Anybody got any family you don't like to talk about? Crazy Uncle Larry, crazy. I've got dysfunction on both sides of my families. I mean, I can count on one hand the number of times that all of my family on either side all got together under one roof in one place. I mean, that's sad because there was always drama. There was always bickering and infighting going on. So this part of the family would get together and this part of the family would get together, but the whole family never got together. And that was probably a good thing. But we've all got painful parts of our past that we're like, we just don't talk about that. Well, people would do that with their genealogies. Well, here Matthew is establishing the genealogy, the identity of the Son of God to be Israel's long-awaited Messiah. But instead of glossing over kind of the shameful, painful parts of the ancestry, the shameful, painful parts of the past, Matthew goes a step further and intentionally highlights some parts of the journey, some parts of the story that most faithful Jews would rather not talk about. As a matter of fact, Matthew even includes some women, which to us we're like, well, what's the big deal about that? But in those days, especially in Middle Eastern cultures that are very patriarchal, very male-dominated, a lot of times women didn't get much ink. I mean, when you read the Old Testament genealogies, it was always this father begat these sons, and these sons begat these sons, and very seldom would a woman even be mentioned. Even the daughters didn't get, and women don't get mad at me. That's just how it was. I didn't write the story. I'm just telling you how the story was written. Women never got mentioned, but Matthew intentionally mentions 4 women, and 3 of the 4 women are not even from the Jewish community. They were Gentiles. They were outsiders. They would not even be allowed to worship in the temple with devout Jews. And Matthew intentionally highlights these, and all 4 of these women have stories, or they represent stories. He goes on in verse 3. He says, Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. And I got in trouble because I forgot it was a family service, so I went into a little too much detail in the first service. But just to help you guys out, and don't ever say the Bible's boring, Tamar was Judah's daughter-in-law. I mean, that's like incest. That was forbidden in the law of Moses. That's kind of shunned in every major culture except Tennessee and Kentucky. So I know what some of you are thinking, and like, hey, in Arkansas, but those are my people. So we gave birth to kissing cousins, so you shut your face, okay? We declare that the real hillbillies reside in Tennessee and Kentucky. But it goes on down, and verse 4, Ram, the father of Abinadab and Abinadab. And if you're ever looking for a good name for your child, just go to the Bible. Man, find something creative like Abinadab, and the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon was the father of Boaz, and Boaz was the... whose mother was Rahab, and she was a prostitute. So you're like, whoo, man, why did you have to put her in the story? Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Ruth's story was tragic, that had a beautiful redemptive ending, but Ruth had a very painful story. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of King David. So now Matthew has made the connection from Jesus to David, but he includes some more detail. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. And this is where I went into a little too much detail in first service. But Matthew was like, oh, by the way, David, who we revere, that we're trying to make this connection to, he was an adulterer and a murderer, by the way. And so it begs the question, in a day and an age where people went to great lengths to portray themselves in greatest light, why did God, who inspired Matthew to record the genealogy of Jesus, lead Matthew into such painful, shameful parts of Jesus' ancestry? And it was because Matthew wanted us to know that Jesus came from broken people, and that Jesus is not intimidated by the shameful and the painful parts of our past. That no matter what we have done, no matter where we've been, no matter what's happened in our history or even in our family's history, that Jesus is not intimidated by our past. He's not intimidated by our history. And Matthew wanted us to know that Jesus came from broken people because Jesus came for broken people. And nobody knew that better than Matthew. Because in Matthew's gospel, Matthew provides us some insight into how he met Jesus and how he became a follower of Jesus. In Matthew chapter 9 and verse 9, it says, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew. And Matthew's like, hey, that's me. That's the Matthew that we're talking about. He saw a man named Matthew sitting at a tax collector's booth. Now, as much as taxes and tax collectors and IRS agents makes our blood just boil and just, those little doodads stand up on the back of our neck because we're like, everybody hates taxes. Everybody hates all the people associated with collecting taxes. Tax collectors in Jesus' day were looked upon with even greater scorn. You see, in Jesus' day, the Israelite nation was under the oppression of the massive Roman Empire. And Rome had a policy of taxing heavily their conquered lands. It was how they funded the incredible Roman military machine. It's how they funded their military escapades into conquering more lands. And Rome only had one policy when it come to collecting taxes. They would basically subcontract the right to collect Rome's taxes out to locals. And the only rule was Rome gets its money. Anything you do beyond that, we don't care. So a local person would purchase the right to collect taxes. There was taxes on roads and bridges and every conceivable thing. And say Rome's tax was 10%. Well, the tax collector could charge 12. They could charge 15. They could charge 25. All Rome cared was that they got their 10. So these tax collectors essentially made themselves rich off of the oppression of their very own people. They were considered sellouts. They were considered traitors. They were hated by everybody. They had their own category. As you read the New Testament, there's a number of times you read sinners and tax collectors. There were sinners. There were people that everybody knew they're bad. They knew they were bad. Everybody knew they were bad. But there was another category of people lower than sinners, and that was the tax collectors. And Matthew says, yeah, that's who I am. Matthew was not afraid to confront the painfulness, the brokenness of his past, that I was a sellout, I was a traitor, I was hated by my very own people. That's where Jesus met me. Follow me, Jesus told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. This was a life-changing moment for Matthew, and in celebration of that, Matthew throws a party, and Matthew invites to his party the same people that you invite to your party, his friends. You invite people that are like you. So Matthew invited all of his tax collector friends to this party that he threw for Jesus and his disciples. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, the Pharisees were the religious people. They thought they had the inside track with God. They were good, and they knew they were good, and they wanted everybody else to know how good they were. And they saw Jesus, who claimed to be sent by God, hanging out with all these people that were not good. I mean, they were not only not good, they were tax collectors. They were the lowest of the low. So they asked Jesus' disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? And the disciples probably responded, we don't know. Why don't you ask him yourself? Because we're uncomfortable hanging around people like this. We don't want Matthew in our group. He's the scum of the earth. He's a sellout. He's a traitor. Matter of fact, we want to send him out back with Judas, because there was another Judas, not the one that betrayed Jesus, that was a zealot. And they were ultra white ring nationalists. They were like, Viva la Revolution. Let's grab a sword and a horse and drive out the Romans. So you've got Judas that's eyeballing Matthew saying, got my eye on you, son. I catch you not looking. You're going down. I mean, there's like nobody wanted to be around Matthew. On hearing this, Jesus said, it's not the healthy who need a doctor. but the sick. And Jesus said, hey, we got to get this straight. I ain't come for healthy people. I ain't come for good people. I came for broken people. I came for people like Matthew who understand who they are. I came for people like Matthew who, no matter how hard they might try, they can't run from their past. They can't hide their sin and their shame. But these are the people that I've come from. I come from broken people. I understand humanity. I understand sin and brokenness and imperfection, and I'm not intimidated by it in the least. As a matter of fact, it's the very reason that I have come. And this morning, that's the reason that I love Jesus. I grew up in church. I've always known the stories. I've always known the right answers. But there was a long season in my life that I did not love Jesus, and I really did not like God. I was scared of him. I thought he did not like me. I could never be good enough for him. I was always fearful that with one more wrong misstep, because there was many, that he would strike me down and be done with me forever. But I finally came to a place in my life that I discovered Jesus for who he was. And I discovered that he was not intimidated by my sin. He was not repulsed by my brokenness, but rather he was merciful to me, where I expected him to be angry and distance himself from me because of my sin. Instead, in mercy, he ran to me, not to condemn, not to judge, not to punish, but instead to purify, to heal, and restore. And when I saw Jesus for who he was, I fell in love with him, and things have never been the same in my life. And here is Matthew, the lowest of the low, sitting at a tax collector's booth, and the sinless Son of God says, I'm not intimidated by your past. I'm not repulsed by your sin. I want you to be a part of my family. I come from broken family, and I have come to restore broken people and make them whole again. And what the Pharisees couldn't figure out is because they thought they were good. They thought surely if God was going to send a representative to the world, that he would be like them, that he would want to hang around the righteous, the good people. And Jesus said, no. The reason I've not come to you is because you're broken, but you're not willing to admit that you're broken. You see, there's basically two kinds of people that reject God. There are those that think they can never be good enough. They're fearful that God will reject them. So as kind of a preemptive strike, they reject God. Because one thing all of us have in common is we hate rejection. We hate rejection. And because we so deeply fear that God will reject us because we know that we're not good, we just reject God. It's kind of like when we were in junior high and we're dating somebody and we catch wind that they're about to dump us. We make the decision, no, I'm going to dump you first, because I would rather be the one doing the dumping than getting dumped. I would rather be the one rejecting you than getting rejected, and we do the same thing to God. We fear that he's going to reject us, so we simply say to God, I don't want any part of you. And then there are the people that think they don't need God because they're already good. Now, they hide it like this. Well, I know I'm not perfect. Like that's revelation to anybody that knows them. But in their minds, because they're better than some or better than most, they don't really need a Savior. They'll go to church, they'll be religious, they'll look to God to help them be a little better than they are, but they're not broken in their mind. They don't need healing. They do not need salvation. But the Apostle Paul reminds us in Romans chapter 3, he says, as it is written, there is no one righteous. Nobody. Not even one. There's no one who understands. There's no one that seeks God on their own. All have turned away. Everybody. We've all rebelled. We've all turned our back on God. They have become altogether worthless. There is no one who does good. There's nobody that's good enough. Not even one. And then the indictment in verse 20, therefore no one, nobody, zilch, nada, not a single person will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. There is no moral code that we can live up to that will ever make us right in the eyes of God. Because apart from Jesus, we are hopelessly and helplessly broken people. You see, this morning we can't fully appreciate the Christmas story unless we understand why there is a Christmas story. The destination on the road to Bethlehem was never Bethlehem. The destination was always a hill outside the city of Jerusalem, where the sinless Son of God would offer himself up on a cross to die for the sins of broken humanity so that we could be restored and be made right with God again. The night before Jesus' arrest and ultimate crucifixion, he shared one last meal with his disciples. And in that meal, he made a statement that gave them insight into what was about to happen. In Luke 22:19, it says, and he took bread, and he gave thanks, and he broke it. And he gave it to them, saying, this is my body given for you. Another translation says, this is my body broken for you. Jesus came from broken people. Jesus came for broken people. But Jesus became broken so that broken people could be restored. And this morning, that's where every one of us in this room stand today. It's not just a feel-good story, but it's a story of redemption. It's a story that declares the eternal and unrelenting love of God. That says, I'm not intimidated by sin and shame. I'm not intimidated by brokenness and the painful parts of your past. But I have sent my Son to become broken on your behalf so that your brokenness can be healed. I didn't come to make bad people good. I come so that the dead could become alive. I come that the broken could be healed. And this morning, apart from Jesus, we are helplessly and hopelessly broken. But the Christmas story declares the love of God for you is so great that Jesus was willing to become broken so that you could be healed. Father, we love you this morning. We celebrate